Welcome to today's fireside chat on Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server. My name is Carlo Doherty. I'm a principal Microsoft licensing consultant here at version 1. I'm joined today by my colleague from the SAM practice, Richard Ojo. How are you today, Richard?
I'm very well, Carl. How are you?
Good, not too bad. So we're back again for our next fireside chat installment on SQL Server, or Azure Benefit for SQL Server, should I say. Um, so if you've had a chance to look at our previous fireside chat for Windows Server, Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server, many of you know that Azure Hybrid Benefit is a software assurance benefit that in effect allows you to realize greater return for investment from the investments that you've made in on-premise licenses by allowing you bring those licenses to a certain degree to Azure and eliminate some of the rental fees, as is this case we're going to talk about today, SQL Server. So it's a great way if you've made an investment in license and software assurance over the years. It allows you to, in effect, reduce your, as we're going to talk about today, SQL Server consumption costs in Azure. A little bit different this one, right? So Windows Server is kind of straightforward in terms of the flavors that you have as to how they apply. With SQL Server, there's quite a lot of flexibility here. There's IaaS and there's PaaS offerings, which give customers great variety and choice in terms of how they choose to migrate their SQL Server investments on-premise into Azure. So, Richard, you're looking at this on quite a frequent basis. At a very high level, what are those kind of four flavors, if you want to call it, that are out there when it comes to SQL Server, or should I say the Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server is actually over four main flavors. The first, Azure VMs, then you have Azure Dedicated Host, Azure SQL Server Database, and Azure Data Factory SQL Server Integration Services. So those are the four main flavors that are available. Now, within each of those flavors, Microsoft or Azure give you certain benefits that you can take advantage of. Let me just run through maybe one or two examples. So let's take, for example, Azure VMs. So if you have SQL Server Enterprise core licenses and you're moving them into Azure VMs, if you move it into SQL Server Enterprise virtual machines, one on-premise core is equal to one vCPU. However, if you move that same enterprise SQL Server Enterprise core license into SQL Server standard virtual machines, one core license gives you four vCPUs. Um, and if you juxtapose that with maybe looking at the standard version of SQL Server, if you were to take SQL Server standard core licenses into Azure VMs, one SQL Server standard into SQL Server standard virtual machines, one on-premise core is one vCPU. If you move it into enterprise virtual machines, you would need four core licenses, four on-premise core licenses for one vCPU, right? So there are a few multipliers to keep in mind when you're moving into any of these four environments. The other one I could maybe talk about would be the SQL dedicated hosts, which is not too dissimilar to what you would have on premise. So on premise, as of today, if you have a highly virtualized environment, you would license the underlying physical host and then deploy an unlimited number of VMs running SQL Server. It's the same here if you were to move into Azure dedicated hosts running SQL Server. You'd be able to take advantage of the same iVirtualization rights that you have as on-premise. You also then maybe can take advantage of the extended security updates on the Azure dedicated host, enhanced failover and licensing benefits. So there are a few benefits in there within each one of those options that can be explored. And I think depending on your workload, your organization, you can take advantage of all four, one of the four. You can mix and match to suit your needs.
So this is, it's probably fair to say this is a really unique benefit within Azure. you can leverage if you have made an investment in software assurance for SQL Server. Because I know, particularly when we look at the world of PaaS, that this type of benefit doesn't extend to bringing your own licenses to other clouds that may have PaaS offerings. So I think there's a great variety of options here for organizations to pick a model that best fits the needs of their business. And I think, just a very high level, I think what I've seen when this benefit has been optimized to its full potential, some of the cost savings that can be achieved are somewhere around the region of, low level, about 15 odd percent, up to the late 40s perhaps. Um, One thing you probably need to keep in mind is that, this is a software assurance benefit, so there is a cost associated with maintaining that software assurance, because as soon as that software assurance lapses, the benefit ceases to exist, which is an interesting one in itself, because you need to realize that with this particular benefit, like Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server, this is a trust-based model, right? So it's an honor-based system. There's no checks and balances here. It's up to the organization to make sure that you're in compliance and working inside Microsoft's licensing rules as to how the benefit is being applied. So that's a really important one, because it's quite easy to fall outside of the rules by not fully understanding how the benefit should be applied within your Azure estate. So I'll give you kind of some really simple examples on this one. Is that if, say, for example, you don't understand what your effective license position is on premise and how your license entitlement applies to your SQL Server estate on premise, there is a risk that you start to take licenses, or start to use Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server, and by doing so, you're removing the right to use some of those licenses on premise, and that can create a gap in your licensing position on premise, which leads to a potential position of non-compliance, risk of audit, and so on and so forth. So it's really important that you realize that it's a trust-based model, that you need to have the right governance in place to track and manage this, because of the lack of dual use rights. Dual use rights do exist, but they're primarily associated with the migration phase. There's a certain number of days that you'll be permitted to migrate from the on-prem world to the cloud, and have licenses running at the same time in both scenarios. But one thing I would say is that this isn't a one and done type exercise. It requires constant vigilance, and I think there's the compliance messaging that I've given there, and making sure that you don't fall outside the licensing terms. But one of the other things that we see is that some organizations start to use this benefit in the early days of their Azure journey, and that might be against machines that might not be, best fit for Azure Hybrid Benefit. As you start to scale your investment in Azure, you probably start to see scenarios where the benefit can be moved around your estate and better applied to reduce costs even further than, say, applying it to machines that might not necessarily get the best return on investment by applying the benefit. So really important that you have that governance and control in place on an ongoing basis. Really good to involve your software asset management or your licensing team to make sure that risk isn't being created in the estate. So kind of keeping it on cost saving, Richard, like what would be the things that you see out there in terms of helping orgs to make sure that they're maximizing the cost saving potential from this benefit?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I think just touching on one or two things that you already mentioned there. We talk a lot about cost savings, but cost avoidance is also something we can point out here. Making sure that licenses that you've already moved into Azure are not then being used on premise is a cost avoidance. Obviously, an audit risk eliminator if you want to just make sure that you're not double using the issues. The other saving that we can look at, like you mentioned, is if you started your Azure journey early and applied your hybrid benefits to smaller workloads that don't really need it, then it's important to reassess those environments, and maybe to take out the Azure hybrid benefits and apply to servers or workloads that are constantly on or running 24/7, 365 days a year, high availability workloads. Those might require the Azure Hybrid benefits more than maybe a test environment or a small dev environment that nobody really uses. So it's important to review those. Other benefits that, or other savings that you can get here is another thing I mentioned earlier was the Azure dedicated host. Taking advantage of a highly virtualized environment will also go a long way to helping you save costs, right? And also you have SQL Server VMs that have related VMs operating a passive high availability or disaster recovery instance. You can exploit the SQL Server failover rights here to um, make some savings. Then there's some little changes you can make as well in your licensing, such as using SQL Server Developer for your non-production environment. The one thing to keep in mind here is that SQL Developer has the same component as SQL Server Enterprise. So just where you want to mirror your prod environment to your non-prod environment, just keep that in mind so that you don't have a mismatch of capabilities between those environments. Also, using your Visual Studio or MSDN subscriptions to license those environments would also go a long way. Taking advantage of your EA test and dev benefits will allow you the flexibility of low cost licensing solutions. So there are a few options there that we can play with, we can mix and match. And there are definitely cost saving opportunities with using Azure Hybrid Benefits.
Yeah. So I think when you look at the messaging on Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server, in theory, the stuff looks pretty straightforward to get your head around, but it does need a huge amount of careful consideration. And I think, having the support of a licensing specialist is key, working in tandem with, technical decision makers to make sure that, you're keeping inside the rules, but you're also maximizing the benefit to the best of your ability is really key here. So, as we say at the end of all these fireside chats, if you have any burning questions on all things Microsoft licensing related, or for that matter, if you have any burning questions associated with the Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server, please do reach out to us. The SAM practice here at version 1 would be delighted to field any questions that you might have. So thank you for attending today's session. Hopefully you found it useful, and we look forward to seeing you on our next fireside chat soon. Take care.